The vast emptiness of space stretched before James Miller's exploration vessel, the Wanderer. As a survey pilot for the Human Space Exploration Corps, he had mapped dozens of planets, but something about this one was different. The small world, designated PX-427, glowed with an eerie blue light that seemed to pulse through its dense atmosphere. Initiating descent sequence, James muttered to himself, his fingers dancing across the control panel. The ship's computer warned him about the unusual crystalline formations scattered across the planet's surface, their energy signatures unlike anything in the database. The Wanderer broke through the cloud cover, revealing a landscape that took James's breath away. Massive purple-leafed trees stretched toward the twin suns, their branches intertwined with glowing crystal formations. The jungle below seemed to pulse with life, but according to his scanners, there were no signs of advanced civilization. James landed the ship in a small clearing, the engines stirring up clouds of iridescent pollen. The air was breathable, according to his instruments, but he still pulled on his exploration suit, standard protocol for first landings. The helmet sealed with a soft hiss as he stepped toward the airlock. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth standard, making each step feel bouncy and uncertain. James activated his data recorder and began cataloging the local flora. The crystals seemed to hum with an inner energy, responding to his presence with subtle changes in their glow. "Fascinating," he said, taking samples of the soil near one of the larger crystal clusters. "These formations appear to be semiconductive, possibly some form of natural computer network." A rustle in the undergrowth caught his attention. James froze, his hand instinctively moving to the stun pistol at his hip. Years of training had taught him to be cautious on unexplored worlds. The movement came again, closer this time. Something large was approaching through the dense vegetation. James backed slowly toward his ship, keeping his eyes fixed on the spot where the rustling originated. What emerged from the jungle made his blood run cold. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, its obsidian scales gleaming in the crystal light, was a creature that every space explorer had been warned about. A shadowclaw, the galaxy's most feared predator. James had seen the briefings. These creatures had destroyed entire colonies, torn through reinforced walls like paper, and showed an almost supernatural ability to hunt their prey. Their curved talons could slice through battleship armor, and their speed was legendary. The Shadowclaw's 6 eyes fixed on James, each one a different shade of amber. Its head tilted slightly, studying him with an intensity that seemed almost curious. This wasn't the mindless aggression described in the reports. James knew he should run. The ship was only 20 meters away. He might make it if he sprinted now, but something about the creature's behavior made him hesitate. It wasn't charging, wasn't displaying the typical hunting patterns described in the manuals. The creature took a step forward, and James noticed something he hadn't seen before. A deep gash ran along its side, glowing with an infected purple light. The Shadowclaw was injured, and if he wasn't mistaken, it was favoring its left leg. "You're hurt," James said softly, knowing the creature couldn't understand him, but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. To his amazement, the Shadowclaw's defensive posture relaxed slightly. This went against everything James had been taught. Shadowclaws were supposed to be mindless killing machines, yet this one was showing signs of intelligence, perhaps even trust. Making what was either the bravest or most foolish decision of his life, James slowly reached into his medical kit and pulled out a universal healing patch. The Shadowclaw watched his movements but didn't retreat or attack. "I want to help," James said, holding up the patch where the creature could see it. "If you'll let me." The Shadowclaw's external breathing chambers fluttered, creating a soft whistling sound. It took another step forward, then another, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. As the twin suns began to set, casting the jungle in deep purple shadows, James Miller found himself standing face to face with a creature that had inspired terror throughout the galaxy. In that moment, He realized he was about to either make history or become another statistic in the long list of lives claimed by these magnificent predators. The choice he made next would change everything. James held his breath as the massive shadow claw moved closer. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he kept his hand steady, still holding out the healing patch. The creature's amber eyes studied the medical device with obvious intelligence. "Easy now," James whispered. The shadow claw's head snapped up at his voice, but instead of aggression, its external breathing chambers produced a soft, almost musical sound. Taking a chance that could either make history or end his life, James slowly removed his helmet. The planet's air was sweet and thick with the scent of alien flowers. The shadow claw's nostrils flared, taking in his scent. To James's amazement, the creature lowered itself to the ground, stretching out its injured side. The meaning was clear. It was accepting his help. Moving with deliberate slowness, James approached the wound. Up close, the shadow claw's scales were even more beautiful, shifting colors like oil on water. "This might sting a bit," he warned. Carefully applying the healing patch, the creature tensed but didn't move. The patch began to glow as it analyzed the injury and released appropriate medication. While the medicine worked, James noticed something extraordinary. The crystals nearest to them had changed color, matching the rhythm of the shadow claw's breathing. He pulled out his scanner, recording the phenomenon. "You're connected to them somehow, aren't you?" he asked. The creature's eyes blinked in sequence, and the crystals pulsed brighter. A low rumble, like distant thunder, emerged from the shadow claw's chest. It wasn't threatening. If anything, it seemed like an attempt at communication. James found himself talking back, explaining what the healing patch was doing, how it worked. The creature listened with unmistakable attention. "I think I'll call you Rex," James said, smiling as the shadow claw's head tilted at the name. "It means king in an ancient Earth language. Seems fitting for someone like you." Rex's wound was already looking better, the angry purple glow fading. The creature stood, testing its injured side. Its movements were smoother now, the pain clearly diminishing. Suddenly, Rex's head snapped toward the jungle. James tensed, but the shadow claw made a gentle chirping sound. From the undergrowth emerged 3 smaller shadow claws, each about half Rex's size. "Your family?" James asked, fighting the urge to retreat. The younger ones approached cautiously, their scales shifting through shades of blue and green. Rex made a series of clicking sounds, and to James's surprise, the juvenile settled down nearby, watching him with obvious curiosity. One of the young ones picked up a crystal in its mouth and brought it to James. The crystal glowed brighter as it came closer, its light pulsing in time with the young shadow claw's heartbeat. "Thank you," James said, carefully accepting the gift. The moment his fingers touched the crystal, a wave of emotions washed over him. Curiosity, friendship, gratitude. He nearly dropped it in shock. The crystals. They're some kind of communication device. Rex's eyes sparkled with what could only be described as amusement. The adult shadow claw touched another crystal with its tail, and James felt more complex emotions and even abstract thoughts flow through the one he held. "This is incredible," James breathed. "You're not just intelligent. You have your own technology, your own way of sharing information. Everything we thought we knew about your species was wrong." The young shadow claws had moved closer now, one of them bold enough to sniff at James's boots. Rex watched the interaction with what seemed like approval, the crystals around them creating a gentle light show of blues and greens. James sat down on a nearby log, and the young ones gathered around him like eager students. He pulled out his data pad and began showing them pictures of Earth, other planets he'd visited, and his ship. They chirped and clicked, their scales rippling with colors of excitement. As the day wore on, James realized he was experiencing something unprecedented in human history. He wasn't just studying these creatures, he was being accepted into their family group. Every xenobiologist who had ever studied shadow claws had approached them as monsters to be feared. None had ever simply tried to be their friend. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the crystal forest. Rex made a gentle rumbling sound and gestured toward a path leading deeper into the jungle. The invitation was clear. James looked back at his ship, then at his new companions. The choice was easy. He gathered his essential equipment and followed his new family into the growing darkness, ready to learn the truth about the galaxy's most misunderstood species. Following Rex and the young Shadowclaws through the crystal forest, James found himself entering a world that no human had ever seen. The path led them to a vast clearing where the crystals grew in intricate patterns, forming what looked like a natural amphitheater. More Shadowclaws emerged from various directions, their scales shimmering in the crystal light. James counted at least 20 adults and a dozen juveniles. Instead of the panic he might have felt days ago, he felt only fascination. Rex led him to the center of the gathering. The crystals around them began to pulse with complex patterns of light, and James felt the crystal he carried respond, connecting him to a web of thoughts and emotions. "It's like a neural network," he murmured, pulling out his data recorder. Through the crystal's connection, he sensed no objection to his documentation. In fact, he felt encouragement from the assembled Shadowclaws. One of the older Shadowclaws approached, its scales a deep midnight blue. It touched a large crystal formation with its tail, and suddenly James's mind filled with images. He saw the history of their species, their evolution alongside the living crystals. The Shadowclaws hadn't just adapted to the crystals, they had developed a symbiotic relationship with them. "Your hunting behavior," James said suddenly, understanding dawning. "It's not random aggression at all. You're protecting the crystal networks on other worlds, aren't you?" The gathered Shadowclaws rumbled in agreement. Through the crystal link, James saw images of other planets where crystal formations similar to these had once existed. He saw ships landing, miners attempting to harvest the crystals, not realizing they were destroying a living network of consciousness. "The crystals are alive," James whispered. "They're part of you, part of your community. When other species try to mine them." Rex's eyes glowed with approval. The crystal network showed James more. The Shadowclaws didn't want to hurt anyone, but they were bound by duty and survival to protect the crystal networks. Each crystal was like a node in a vast, living computer, storing the collective knowledge and history of their species. A young Shadowclaw approached James, carrying what looked like a broken crystal shard. Through his own crystal's connection, James felt the problem. The shard had been damaged by recent seismic activity, disrupting part of their communal memory. Without hesitation, James pulled out his portable repair kit. "I might be able to help with that," he said. Using a combination of his technical knowledge and the Shadowclaw's crystal-based guidance, he managed to stabilize the shard. The crystal began to glow again, its light synchronizing with the larger network. The Shadowclaw's approval radiated through the crystal link. James felt their gratitude, but also their concern. Through images and emotions, they showed him that other humans were coming. Many humans, with large ships and mining equipment. A corporation, James realized, recognizing the logos in the shared images. They found this place. They'll try to mine the crystals, not knowing what they really are. Rex's scales shifted to a deep red, reflecting concern rather than anger. The other Shadowclaws moved closer, their collective worry pulsing through the crystal network. They showed James images of previous encounters, how they'd been forced to defend crystal networks violently because no other species would listen or try to understand. "But this time it's different," James said firmly. "This time you have someone who can translate, who can help others understand. You're not monsters. You're guardians of something incredible." The eldest Shadowclaw stepped forward, its scales now a brilliant silver. Through the crystal network, it shared a formal invitation. They wanted James to learn their ways, to become a bridge between their species. They would teach him to use the crystal network, to understand their culture and history. In return, they hoped he could help prevent another tragedy, another misunderstanding that would force them to defend their living network with violence. James looked around the gathering, at these creatures who had been so badly misunderstood by the galaxy. Through the crystal he held, he felt their hopes, their intelligence, their deep desire for peaceful coexistence. "I would be honored," he said, and the crystals around them blazed with joy, turning the night into day. The young shadow claws romped playfully around him, their scales flickering with happiness. That night, under the alien stars, James began his real education. He learned that sometimes the most dangerous-looking creatures could be the wisest teachers, and that understanding was the first step toward peace. The peaceful morning shattered with the rumble of entering spacecraft. James bolted upright from his sleep spot among the young shadow claws, his heart racing. Through the crystal network, he felt the entire colony's alarm. Rex appeared at his side, scales shifting to a warning red. Above the crystal forest, 3 massive corporate ships descended, their engines scattering the iridescent pollen that normally floated gently through the air. "Galaxy Resource Corporation," James muttered, recognizing the ship's markings. "They're earlier than we expected." Through his connection to the crystal network, he felt the colony's memories of similar ships on other worlds, of the destruction they brought. The younger shadow claws huddled closer to the adult members, their scales dulled with fear. The ships landed in a cleared area near James's small vessel. Heavy doors opened with hydraulic hisses, and suited figures emerged. Leading them was a man James recognized from corporate broadcasts, Director Thompson of the mining division. "We need to try talking first," James said to Rex. The massive shadow claw rumbled in agreement, though the crystal network hummed with tension. James stepped out of the forest into view, causing the corporate security teams to raise their weapons. "Hold your fire," he shouted. "I'm James Miller, Human Space Exploration Corps." Director Thompson stepped forward, his face twisted with horror as Rex emerged behind James. "Miller, get away from that thing. Security teams, prepare to..." "Stop." James moved between the corporate forces and Rex. "You don't understand what's happening here. The Shadow Claws aren't what we thought they were. They're mindless killers," Thompson spat. "They've destroyed dozens of mining operations. We're here to clear them out and harvest these crystals. The market value is in the trillions." The crystal in James's hand pulsed with sadness and frustration. Through it, he felt Rex trying to share images, trying to explain. But the corporate teams were too far away, too closed off to feel a connection. "The crystals are alive," James explained urgently. "They're part of a vast neural network. The Shadow Claws aren't destroying mining operations out of aggression. They're protecting the sentient system." Thompson laughed. "A convenient story. Step aside, Miller. We have full corporate authority to clear this planet for mining. If you've gone native, we'll simply list you as another casualty of these beasts." More ships appeared in the sky. Mining vessels, heavy equipment carriers. Through the crystal network, James felt the colony's growing desperation. The younger ones were being led deeper into the forest, while adult shadow claws moved into defensive positions. "You're making a terrible mistake," James warned. "These creatures are highly intelligent. The crystals are their technology, their history, their means of communication. If you try to harvest them, you'll be committing an act of war against a sentient species." "Enough." Thompson raised his hand, and the security teams moved forward. "Take him into custody." Extermination teams begin clearing the area. The crystals around them flared with red light. Rex and the other adult shadow claws stepped forward, their scales shifting through patterns James had never seen before. The crystal network hummed with energy, and suddenly every crystal in the forest began to pulse in unison. James felt it through his crystal. The network was activating some kind of defense system. The corporate team's electronics began to spark and fail. Their weapons powered down, suits malfunctioning. "What's happening?" Thompson demanded, his own suit's systems flickering. "They're giving you a warning," James said calmly. "One you should heed. The Shadow Claws have technologies we don't understand. They'd been holding back, trying to avoid killing. Don't make them show you what they're really capable of. The forest around them came alive with movement as more shadow claws emerged, their scales glowing with internal light. The crystal network thrummed with power, and James felt their unified message. This was their home, their family, their future. They would defend it at any cost. Thompson looked at his failed equipment, at the gathering shadow claws, at the pulsing crystal forest. For the first time, fear replaced arrogance in his eyes. The battle for understanding was about to begin, and James knew he stood on the right side of history. The standoff in the crystal forest crackled with tension. Director Thompson's security forces regrouped, pulling out backup weapons that didn't rely on electronics. The shadow claws formed a protective circle around their crystal formations, their scales now glowing with an inner light that James had never seen before. "Last chance, Thompson," James called out. "Look around you. Really look. These aren't mindless beasts. They're protecting their home, their technology, their families." Through the crystal network, James felt Rex's consciousness merge with his own, sharing a plan. The massive shadow claw moved forward, and to everyone's amazement, began manipulating the crystals with its tail. Complex patterns of light danced through the forest. Suddenly, holographic images appeared in the air above them. The crystals projected scenes from Shadow Claw history, their first discoveries of space travel, their peaceful meetings with other species, their desperate battles to protect crystal networks on other worlds. "Impossible," Thompson whispered, watching as the crystal-powered technology displayed capabilities far beyond current human understanding. They're using the crystals as computers. "Not just computers," James explained, feeling the colony's approval through his crystal link. "These crystals are living memory banks, communication devices, and technology we can barely comprehend." The shadow claws evolved alongside them, formed a symbiotic relationship. The young shadow claws emerged from hiding, each carrying a crystal. They approached the corporate forces without fear, offering the crystals as they had once done with James. Some of the security team members lowered their weapons, enchanted by the display. "Sir," one of the security officers said to Thompson, "my readings show these crystals are generating more energy than our entire mining fleet could produce in a year, and they're doing it cleanly, sustainably." Thompson's face changed as realization dawned. The profit potential in clean energy production would dwarf any mining operation. Through the crystal network, James felt the Shadow Claw's willingness to share their knowledge. Rex stepped forward, touching a large crystal formation. The holographic display changed, showing images of possible cooperation. Humans and Shadow Claws working together, learning from each other. "They're willing to teach us," James said. "They've been waiting for a species that would try to understand instead of just taking." "Think about it, Thompson. Instead of destroying this place, you could be the one who brokers the greatest technological exchange in human history." The security teams had completely lowered their weapons now. Several of them had accepted crystals from the young Shadow Claws, their faces filled with wonder as they felt the first touches of the crystal network's consciousness. Thompson looked at his mining ships, then at the magnificent crystal forest alive with intelligence and potential. "Stand down," he ordered. "All teams, stand down." He turned to James. "We'll need to contact corporate headquarters, arrange proper diplomatic channels." Rex's scales shifted to a peaceful blue. Through the crystal network, James felt the colony's joy and relief. The young Shadow Claws bounded playfully around the security teams, their scales flickering with friendly colors. "I can help with the diplomatic arrangements," James offered. "But first, there's something they want to show us, something they've never shared with outsiders before." Rex led the way deeper into the forest, where the crystal formations grew more complex. The corporate teams followed, their earlier fear replaced by curiosity. James felt pride through his crystal link, pride in humanity's ability to change, to understand, to choose peace over profit. The Shadow Claws gathered around a massive central crystal spire that pulsed with rainbow light. As they approached, the crystal began to sing, producing harmonies that touched something deep in the human observers' souls. Through the network, James felt the meaning. This was their ceremony of acceptance, of bringing new friends into their extended family. Thompson stepped forward, his face illuminated by the crystal's glow. All my life, I thought success meant taking, harvesting, profiting. But this is more than resources. This is knowledge, culture, a chance to grow beyond ourselves. The crystal spire's song grew stronger, and in that moment, beneath the alien stars, two species that had once feared each other began to forge a new future, together. The peaceful moment shattered as emergency alarms blared from Thompson's ships. Through the crystal network, James felt a wave of warning from the outer edges of the colony. Something was wrong. "Sir," a security officer ran toward them, his face pale. "Corporate command rejected our diplomatic solution. They've dispatched the elimination fleet, 5 heavy cruisers, armed for full xenocide protocol." Thompson's face hardened. "They can't have received our reports yet. This was planned from the start. They never intended to let us negotiate." The crystal forest pulsed with red warning lights. Through his connection, James felt the approaching threat. Massive ships entering the atmosphere, their weapons already powering up. The colony's memories of similar attacks on other worlds flooded through the network. "How long do we have?" James asked, his crystal glowing hot with shared urgency. 10 minutes, maybe less," Thompson replied, checking his instruments. "Standard corporate procedure. They'll glass the surface, kill everything, then send in the mining drones. No witnesses, no evidence." Rex's scales shifted to a deep purple, a color James had never seen before. Through the crystal network, ancient memories awakened. The Shadow Claws had faced extinction before. They had survived. "They're not defenseless," James realized, feeling the power building in the crystal formations. "Thompson, get your people to shelter. The Shadow Claws are about to show us why they've survived for millions of years." The crystals throughout the forest began to hum with energy. Adult Shadow Claws took positions around key crystal formations, their scales glowing with internal light. The young ones retreated to underground chambers, protected by layers of living crystal. The first corporate cruiser appeared overhead, its weapon systems targeting the largest crystal clusters. Before it could fire, the entire forest lit up like a star. Beams of coherent crystal energy shot skyward, slicing through the cruiser's shields like they didn't exist. The ship's weapons died, its engines failed, and it drifted harmlessly aside. "Incredible," Thompson breathed. "They're using the crystal network as a planetary defense system." More cruisers appeared, launching waves of combat drones. The Shadow Claws moved with incredible coordination, their scales now blazing with light. Each crystal in the forest became a weapon, a shield, a communication node. James felt Rex's call through the network. Together, they rushed to a massive crystal spire. Other Shadow Claws joined them, forming a circle. Through their combined connection to the crystal network, James understood the plan. "Thompson," he shouted, "get everyone clear of the forest. They're about to trigger something big." The corporate forces had landed troops now, armored soldiers advancing through the trees. But they had never faced anything like this. The crystal forest itself came alive, paths shifting, light patterns disorienting the attackers. Shadow Claws moved like living shadows, disabling weapons and armor without killing a single soldier. Rex and the others completed their circle around the spire. Energy coursed through the crystal network, building to impossible levels. James felt it through his crystal. The accumulated knowledge and power of millions of years, about to be unleashed. The spire erupted with light that reached into space itself. Every corporate ship, weapon, and piece of technology simply stopped. The crystal network had transmitted a shutdown code that overwhelmed any human system it touched. In the sudden silence, James stepped forward to address the stranded corporate forces. "Your weapons are disabled. Your ships are dead. The Shadow Claws could have killed you all, but they chose not to. Think about that. The corporate soldiers looked around at the glowing crystal forest, at the majestic shadow claws with their light-filled scales, at the evidence of technology far beyond human understanding. "Stand down," Thompson ordered his people, "and contact corporate command. Tell them to look at their stock prices after everyone learns they tried to commit genocide against a civilization more advanced than our own." Rex moved to James's side, scales shifting to a victorious gold. Through the crystal network, James felt the colony's satisfaction. They had defended their home without taking a single life, proving themselves better than the fears and prejudices that had haunted them across the galaxy. The battle was over. Now the real work of understanding could begin. 6 months after the battle that changed everything, James stood before the Galactic Council, Rex at his side. The great chamber was filled with representatives from hundreds of species, all gathered to witness something unprecedented. "The evidence is undeniable," James spoke, his voice carrying through the vast hall. "The Shadow Claws are not only sentient but possess technological and cultural advancement far beyond our current understanding. Their crystal network technology has already revolutionized our approach to clean energy and faster-than-light communication." The crystal he held pulsed gently, connecting him to Rex and the colony back home. Through it, he could feel their pride and hope for the future. Thompson, now serving as the human corporate liaison to the Shadow Claws, stepped forward with data displays. "In just 6 months of peaceful cooperation, our joint research has produced more technological advances than the last 50 years combined. The crystal network's potential for sustainable energy alone has transformed our economy." The council chamber screens displayed images from PX-427, now officially renamed Crystal Haven by joint human-Shadow Claw agreement. The once feared planet had become a center of interstellar cooperation and learning. Scientists and diplomats from various species worked alongside Shadow Claws, studying the crystal network and its countless applications. "More importantly," James continued, "we've discovered similar crystal formations on 17 other worlds. The Shadow Claws weren't attacking mining operations. They were protecting an interconnected network of living knowledge that spans the galaxy. Their violence was always a last resort, chosen only when communication failed." Young Shadow Claws now played freely with children from other species in specially designed educational centers. The crystal network helped bridge language barriers, allowing direct emotional and intellectual connection between different races. "The Shadow Claws request full membership in the Galactic Council," James announced. "Not just for themselves, but as guardians of the crystal network that belongs to all sentient life. They offer to share their knowledge, their technology, and their understanding of the universe." Rex stepped forward, scales shimmering with diplomatic colors. The crystal network activated, and suddenly every being in the chamber felt the direct, emotionally powerful message of peace and cooperation that the Shadow Claws had always tried to share. The council chamber erupted in supportive voices. Species that had once feared the Shadow Claws now saw them for what they truly were: guardians of an ancient legacy, protectors of knowledge that could benefit all. "Let this be a lesson," James said as the voting began. The galaxy's most feared predator turned out to be its most enlightened teacher. They never wanted war. They never wanted isolation. They were waiting for someone to try understanding instead of fearing. The vote was unanimous. The Shadow Claws were welcomed into the Galactic Council, with James confirmed as their first interspecies ambassador. The Crystal Network was declared a protected resource, to be studied and developed cooperatively by all races. Back on Crystal Haven, the colony celebrated. Young Shadow Claws danced through the forest, their scales painting the night with colors of joy. Human children joined them, each carrying small crystals that connected them to the network's gentle consciousness. James watched the celebration from a quiet spot beside the ancient crystal spire, Rex by his side. Through their shared connection, they felt the happiness of both their peoples. "Did you ever imagine this?" James asked his friend. "When you first found me in the forest?" Rex's scales rippled with amusement. Through the crystal network, James felt the answer. Hope had always been there, waiting for someone brave enough to reach past fear and offer friendship instead. The Crystal Forest glowed with possibilities as night fell on Crystal Haven. In research centers across the planet, humans and Shadowclaws worked together, unlocking the mysteries of the universe. In nurseries, young ones of both species grew up knowing only peace and cooperation. And in the great dark between the stars, the Crystal Network hummed with ancient songs of knowledge, no longer hidden, no longer feared, but shared freely among all who wished to learn and understand. James smiled as a young Shadowclaw brought him a newly formed crystal, its light pulsing with innocent joy. The galaxy's most feared predator had become its greatest teacher, all because one human had dared to offer friendship instead of fear. The end.